Hi, everyone. We're going to get started. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Brina Chu, and I serve as the Community Strategy Manager of Israel Action Network. For those of you who aren't familiar with us, we're a joint initiative of the Jewish Federations of North America and the Jewish Council for Public Affairs, committed to combating the delegitimization of Israel and providing the educational programs, trainings, and other resources our Jewish communities need to build support for Israel in the context of two states for two peoples. We recently unveiled a programming initiative we're calling IAN University, which is a portal for educational programming around Jewish security, fighting all forms of anti-Semitism, including BDS, and navigating difficult conversations around Israel with a wide range of constituencies. Today's session, Young Voices on Zionism, marks the beginning of IAN University. I'm also excited to announce that in response to the rising tide of anti-Zionism IAN has been observing across delegitimization messaging in the US, our program today also kicks off the first of a three-part series exploring Zionism. We at IAN are bringing this to you in partnership with the American Zionist movement and leading up to the 38th World Zionist Congress, which will be held online this year in just 2 weeks from October 20th through the 22nd. American Zionist Movement, or AZM, is comprised of 33 national Jewish Zionist organizations. They're the U.S. Zionist Federation and the World Zionist Organization, or WZO, and recently facilitated the U.S. election to the World Zionist Congress, where 123,000 American Jews voted for their voices in Israel. You can go to azm.org/38WZC to learn more about AZM and the upcoming 38th World Zionist Congress. It's now my pleasure to introduce Eden Cohen, who will be our moderator for today's conversation. Eden Cohen is the president and founder of A Wider Frame, a bi-weekly newsletter created out of a desire to help educate, connect, and engage readers on issues important to the Jewish world. After graduating from University of Wisconsin-Madison, Eden, a Pittsburgh native, spent several months living in Jerusalem. It was in Israel where Eden's passion for advocating for issues impacting Jews around the world actually took shape. In addition to managing her digital newsletter, Eden is a practicing entertainment attorney in Los Angeles and is an active member of several Jewish organizations and institutions, including the Jewish Federation, the Jewish Agency, Connect Israel, FIDF, or Friends of IDF, and Soho Supper Club. Eden resides in Los Angeles with her husband, her 2 dogs, and 2 cats. So a few quick things before we start. First, the session will be recorded and we will be distributing the recording to those who registered and possibly more publicly, but were unable to be here today. If you have any questions throughout the program, please feel free to submit your questions using the Q&A function at any point so they can be addressed during the participant Q&A part of our program, which we're estimating will happen around 1:30, but that might change. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Eden to start off our conversation and introduce our speakers. Thank you so much, Eden.
Thank you. And thank you to Israel Action Network and American Zionist Movement for organizing such an important and meaningful discussion. I'm honored to be moderating today. The Gen Z and Millennial Zionist perspective is very interesting for a number of reasons. There's a true tectonic change in the way the movement and perception around the movement is happening, largely in part with how social media is instrumental in forming opinions. The older generations are having a hard time grappling with the future of Zionism, and the miscommunication flows both ways. Younger generations, too, lack the understanding of what Zionism meant to their predecessors. I hope this conversation could shed some light on how to bridge some of these gaps. I recently launched a Jewish newsletter called A Wider Frame, which gives a comprehensive snapshot of important Jewish world news delivered a few times a week. We're trying to inform young Jews about what's going on in the Jewish world and also to encourage forward thinking when it comes to Zionism, diaspora-Israel relations, anti-Semitism, and other important Jewish world issues. I'm going to start by introducing our very impressive young leader panelists, and then we'll move to some questions. I'm going to start with Jared Jackson. Jared Jackson is the founder and executive director of Jews in All Hues, an education and advocacy organization that builds a world where intersectional diversity and dignity are normative. A Philadelphia-born multi-heritage Jew, Jared is an internationally renowned Jewish diversity leader, consultant, facilitator, speaker, writer, musician, and entrepreneur. He's an alum of the Sela Leadership Program through Bend the Arc. Jared holds a certificate of nonprofit management from LaSalle University and was named one of the Jews that will change the world by periodical Ma'ariv. Along with everything else, Jared is scheduled to graduate from Hebrew Union College with a Master of Arts in Jewish Nonprofit Management in May of 2021. Andrew Keene lives in Washington, D.C., and is originally from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where he was very active in the Reformed Jewish Youth Movement, NIFTY. Andrew served as the North American president of NIFTY on a gap year between high school and college. Andrew currently serves as a member of the management committee of the World Union for Progressive Judaism, where his portfolio includes youth and young adult engagement strategy, and serves as one of the organization's representatives to the United Nations. Andrew also represents the Reform movement as a member of the expanded executive of the World Zionist Organization and Board of Governors of the Jewish Agency for Israel. Andrew holds a degree in entrepreneurship from Drexel University and currently works as a consultant in the digital transformation space. Chloe Levion is a pre-law student at UCLA studying sociology and Israel studies. She is the Southwest and Pacific Northwest Campus Liaison for StandWithUs, a Hasbara Fellow on the board of Bruins for Israel and a member of the Student Advisory Board for the Israel Studies Department at UCLA, and a member of Iranian American Jews for Racial Justice. The first few questions that I'm asking are more personal in nature, and I'd love to hear from you all separately. Please try to keep your answers tight as we are limited on time and have a lot of ground to cover. I'm going to be asking some really heavy-hitting questions that we could probably expand on for hours each, but let's do the best we can with the time we have. After the first few questions, I'll be giving prompts that are less specific to each of you personally, and you can all feel free to answer in a more discussion-based manner. To start us off, what does your Jewish identity mean to you, and how does it uniquely present as a millennial Gen Z Jew? In other words, how has growing up in the millennial Gen Z era influenced your relationship with Judaism? And why don't we start with Chloe?
Thank you for that question. Being Jewish is so much more than just a religion for me. It is my community, and that has given me a way to connect to many others in my generation, specifically through Jewish TikTok and Jewish Twitter, to conferences. It gives me a way to connect with more than just other people. It gives me a community wherever I am.
Great. Andrew?
Sure. As you said, I grew up in the Reform movement, and one of the pieces of the Reform movement that's always resonated so deeply with me is, where some religions say we have the answers. Reform Judaism, especially, is always focused on we have the questions, and that willingness to question, as well as a really solid, value framework, has helped guide me as I, in the professional world and engaging with current events and engaging with people of all generations. It's been a very constant North Star for me.
Jared?
My Jewish identity is really wrapped up in humanistic values, and those values are also shared throughout Judaism. And so it comes all in one big ball for me.
Yeah, I think we're more removed from synagogue and other Jewish institutions, or at least that's my feeling in the U.S., and more assimilated than ever before. But we also have more access to a wide variety of Jewish experiences in the way that older generations never had. So that's kind of my take on this. I'm going to lump a few together for the next few questions. First, why are you a Zionist? And second, what motivates you guys to be leaders in the Zionist space and stay connected to Zionism? And also, please tell us a little bit more about your involvement in various organizations and why these organizations speak to you. And considering that the Zionist Congress is approaching in 2 weeks, for those of you who are involved, feel free to expand on your involvement there. Jared, do you want to take this first? I know it's a lot.
It is a lot.
Yeah.
So I'll just say that for me, why I'm a Zionist is partially because of like my mom and how I was raised, and becoming aware of Zionism in particular around the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin. And for me, that also meant growing up with a sense of Zionism that demanded accountability and believed in multiculturalism and having a multiracial community. It wasn't necessarily connected to the synagogue, as you said. I'm definitely caught up in that. But it's also led me to do a lot of things in life, including getting involved with like the ROI community and getting involved with the Hatikva slate, where Zionism is, I don't have to like just say that like I'm like, I don't take issue with whatever, but that I can proudly say that I'm a Zionist, and I've been a Zionist for a very long time. And that doesn't mean that I'm going to blindly go along with things, right? As Andrew said about questioning, there are always questions in the air. There are always, accountability has a set of questions, and me getting involved in the Congress and all is also part of that.
Andrew?
Sure. Zionism really is a part of my family. The 3 generations before me were active in the Zionist movement long before there was a modern day state of Israel, and those stories have always been an inspiration to me. And I've been in Milwaukee since June, and have spent a lot of time just reading and looking at photos and really getting a deeper appreciation for how my family members were so connected and compelled by the Zionist movement. I don't think that's why I stayed involved, though. Why I stayed involved is because for me, Zionism is not a binary, do you subscribe to it or do you not? It's really a vision for the future, and a vision for a modern day state of Israel that in many ways has been a huge success, but in probably just as many ways is still unfulfilled. And I think our role as leaders in in my case, the World Zionist Organization, or the Zionist movement, as well as the Reform movement of Judaism, is to chart that course in small ways and large ways of how we transpose our Reformed Jewish values, our progressive Zionist values, onto the future of the state of Israel, so that it does live up to the aspirations and the hopes that are that the Zionist leaders who came before us held so dearly.
Sure. And Chloe?
Being a Zionist is a very significant part of my identity. For me, Zionism is my mom being able to spend the duration of the Iranian Revolution in the safety of Israel, the Jewish ancestral and indigenous homeland, and the rise of anti-Semitism and misinformation, specifically on college campuses, motivates me to be an unapologetic Zionist leader, and the village of support I get from other organizations and other Zionists motivates me and allows me to continue to be resilient.
Great. My next question is, Zionism has come to be a dirty word in a lot of circles. Has it ever affected your own beliefs or use of the term and relationship with it? And were there times in your life you've been afraid to identify as a Zionist? Chloe, you can start with this one.
Thank you for that question. During my freshman year, I had a few moments where I was questioning my own beliefs, wondering if I was on the right side of history. Luckily, those moments didn't last more than a few minutes, but I choose to take ownership in the word Zionist because the term is so often demonized by defining it. When I'm in more hostile environments, I use it as an opportunity to leave that person with a positive experience with a Zionist and leave them with the true definition of what Zionism means.
Andrew?
Yeah, you're so right that it has come to be a dirty word in many circles, university campuses, so on. And to me, that's really, and as Chloe alluded to, out of a misunderstanding or misconception or lack of understanding of what the definition of Zionism actually is versus how it's interpreted or applied or in many cases misconstrued. And so the times that I've been in the hot seat as how could you identify as being a Zionist, I've also used it as an opportunity to educate and to reframe and to paint a broader understanding of what Zionism is for me. Not to say it needs to be the same for someone else, but what it could be also. And I think part of it, as I alluded to earlier, it's not a binary you are or you aren't. For me, it's more of an active verb. And I feel that many people, when that spectrum is opened up to them, are more willing to engage, not necessarily, converted to my way of thinking, but
Right.
more willing to engage openly with it.
Jared, how about you?
It really depends on the context, right? It really depends on who's saying what, or if I'm willing to even engage that person. Yes, Zionism has some negative connotations out there, and the conflation of being Zionist with being like anti-human rights, with being sort of like in the second Bush era, everybody said like, well, not everybody, but a lot of people claimed that like Israel was just receiving a blank check and being used by the government, and that everybody else in Israel was like blindly in line. I mean, for those people, I have to actually ask: Have you ever met Jews? None of us are really of the same mind because we all have our own mind. So it really depends. Also, if it's somebody who says that, oh, you're a bad Jew because you question Israel on things, I think that's just being a good Zionist, is questioning Israel on things and holding Israel accountable for its actions, however one can. Also, anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism seem to be conflated. And that's another battle that we need to wage. Because for some who are reading against Zionism, they're actually longtime anti-Semites and need to. Sorry, is it breaking up for you guys?
Sure, I could hear a little bit of wind, but I can still hear you.
Okay. Hopefully those are the things of change. But having, we have to actually look into the histories of the people actually using Zionism as a negative thing. We have to look into what relationships we have with them, whether they're spoken or unspoken, whether they're direct or indirect. We're never lacking communication here. Whether or not we talk to people, whether or not we don't talk to people, we are still communicating. So those are just.
Sure, yeah. I think you guys hit on a lot of interesting points. I personally have never met a Zionist who wasn't also critical of the Israeli government for, on either end of the spectrum. And I think conflating anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, that's a whole discussion in itself. And so I think that really takes us into our next question, which is, what do you think is the most common misconception? And by the way, the rest of these questions will be less specific to you each personally, so I'd love everyone to kind of chime in discussion style here. What do you think is the most common misconception amongst your peers when it comes to Zionism, and how do we combat it? What have been the most helpful tactics and strategies in responding to delegitimization in movements on the left and the right, and what should we be doing more of going forward? So you guys can just chime in together. We can talk about this.
I'll jump in, and I'll pick up on what Jared was ending with. I think many people identify Zionism as a whole with being synonymous as to whatever the Israeli government is doing and whatever their policies are. And to me, that would be, like saying I disagree with something the American government is doing, and thus I am anti-American. That these two things can and should and have to exist, not necessarily in equilibrium, but they have to exist together, where I can say I am a Zionist, period, and my Jewish values, my Zionist values are in conflict currently with X, Y, and Z policy of the Israeli government. And I think a lot of people don't understand that can exist at the same time. That's not going to correct where there's issues of anti-Semitism, but where there's issues of lack of understanding, that helps open up the conversation. And, to part of your question, as I said earlier, one of the things that I treasure about the reform movement is we put the emphasis on the questions rather than the answers. And I think what happens, when this conversation about Zionism heats up is we start speaking our answers rather than engaging each other in questions. And we're just never going to get anywhere in this conversation, and we're never going to, it's just not productive to only speak your own, speak your truth is one thing, but to speak your point of view without relent, without being able to understand where other people are coming from in their relationship to Zionism. So there is room to engage when we're talking about Zionism being misunderstood or as a misconception. Anti-Semitism separate.
Sure. And do you guys think that there is a bigger part of a misconception that we should focus on more than another part? Like, do you think that people need to learn what Israel has historically meant to the Jewish people as part of their understanding, or kind of at what point when you're engaging with someone who considers themselves anti-Zionist, what do you focus on the most in kind of teaching them about why you're a Zionist and combating these misconceptions? And Chloe and Jared, feel free also to chime in on this one. We're still on the question of what is the most common misconception and helpful strategies in combating delegitimization.
I think the most common misconception is the fabricated dichotomy that being a Zionist means that you're against Palestinian self-determination and that it's one or the other, which is, as we all know, not true. And I think it's critical for Zionists to also recognize that Palestinians also have ties to the land, and it really shouldn't be one or the other. And a helpful tactic for me in those conversations is shifting the conversation to person, listening to their story, explaining your story, and that's how you're able to have helpful dialogue from my experience.
Yeah, I'll echo that. Thank you, Chloe. I think I said this before, where they say that like being Zionist equals not being for human rights. And that's just, for me, that is simply untrue. Also, Israel itself is like multi-religious, multi-heritage, multiracial group of citizens, like in the whole.
You're very right. There's a very common misconception there that it's really not.
Yeah, I mean, not to say that there aren't problems in Israel. I mean, there's still a major problem with racism and other forms of bigotry in Israel. There's still like religious zealots and all who think it's their way or the Chai way. Sorry, at least one pun. So it's I would also say that like there are misconceptions around like the history of Zionism. You know, I rarely meet people who have really looked into Herzl and what his particular vision for the government and the land of Israel would look like. Also, Herzl's Zionism isn't necessarily the same, or isn't the only Zionism that was ever created by a Jew. So there are many writings from like from Iraqi Jews and all, and well, Mizrahi Jews at all, like about Zionism, and I think those histories are swept under the rug. And so when the state of Israel was formed, yes, you have many people who many Jews who have a sense of Zionism, but the question is also what kind of Zionism?
Sure. I also think so many people are so entrenched in the way modern media represents Israel. It's so one-sided that it's hard to get people to look beyond that. I'm not sure if everyone listening today understands the concept of echo chambers, but the idea is that people live in bubbles where the only information they're getting is information that was suitable to them based on what they thought in the first place. How can we better address this? In a world where Zionism has become so divisive and oftentimes a matter of partisan beliefs, how can we disrupt the pattern?
Yeah, this is a super important question, and I don't think people actually fully appreciate how real echo chambers are, especially given how much time we're spending online, you know, now as a, you know, this generation, but also like in the last 6 months intensively. And, you know, I hear people say, well, you know, I have friends on all ends of the political spectrum on Facebook. Oh, well, I have friends, you know, with different, it's not a matter of having friends of differing opinions. It's a matter of there is a system in place to reinforce your views on hot topic issues. And for me, you know, one of the benefits of being involved in organizations like the EZM and the WZO is that it is a round table of the Jewish people in, you know, all of its beliefs and ideological points of view and perspective and politics. And, you know, unless you are really willing to engage with people in real time, to talk about issues and engage with people who don't share the same point of view as you, there is really no way to break those. And so I challenge you to take a look at your calendar from, okay, maybe the last 6 months, but February, January, how much time did you actually spend in real conversation, not online? I mean, it could be, you know, over Zoom or Skype, but in real conversation with people who do not share the same points of view as you on Israel, on politics. And if the answer is none, which for many of us, it probably is, or very close to none, like that therein is the problem, and that is the solution, from my point of view anyways.
Sure, I agree. I think as Jews, we're all really preaching to the choir as well, and it's hard to figure out how to move beyond our own group. But Chloe, sorry, go ahead, sorry. Chloe? Oh, did we?
Well, Chloe's frozen. I'll jump in. I actually don't think the issue is with Jews and non-Jews. I think the issue is very much within the Jewish family, that we need to engage with people on all ends of the spectrum on a regular basis, and spend more time being uncomfortable than being comfortable, and in a way that.
What do you mean by within the Jewish family?
Even within the Jewish family, we we tend to associate with those who share our point of view, our perspective on Israel, our modality of prayer. And that's just not, that doesn't represent the full diversity of the Jewish people. And, you know, when it comes to Israel, if you're not willing to be in conversation with people who don't think, worship, or look like you within the Jewish tent, that's where we get this echo chamber issue, and that's where we get this polarization that seems to be only getting worse, from my opinion.
Love your suggestion. Look at your calendar and try to make it a point to engage with others.
You know,
or sorry, go ahead, Jared.
You know, it's really, here's the other thing that happens in an echo chamber. You end up congratulating people for really weak points, right? Because a lot of ways one of the ways to really sharpen your argument is to have a counter argument, right? Also, not every argument is like cut and dry, right? You have to have nuanced arguments as well, or they don't even have to be arguments, right? I mean, although we are going into the Zionist Congress, it's like, you know, everybody around a dinner table without food. But it doesn't mean that, like, you know, you have to go to like the most extreme, but you do have to have a nuanced conversation. And I think a lot of people just talk past one another and don't have those nuanced conversations, and don't and approach it with a mindset of this is the enemy. Whereas like this is family, and we're going to try to get through this together, and we're going to vehemently disagree with certain things, but we have to have a basis, or we have to have a base that says like, you are human, I see you, I love you, and like, I don't see that often. I see like dehumanizing each other in the process of talking past one another. And so, you know, yeah, I would agree. Make the time to reach out to people. I mean, I have friends who like really don't like one another, like really don't. Like they got into argument at my wedding. Really don't like one another, but like I don't have a problem with either one of them. You know, and we do have nuanced conversations. I'll leave it at that.
Chloe, did you have anything you wanted to add to this? I know you got
I just wanted to echo what Andrew was saying. The way to solve the issue of echo chambers is to leave our echo chambers and engage with the 80% of people who aren't a diehard Zionist or a diehard anti-Zionist, and whose opinions can be changed in a way, who can learn, who are open to more education.
Sure. I'm attempting to disrupt the echo chamber effect with my newsletter, though to a large extent, I still feel like I'm kind of preaching to the choir and not reaching the people who could benefit from the information the most. So I'm working on that myself. Zooming in a little bit, what are some of the ideological and other gaps that divide young Jews today, both among their own age group and from older generations of Jewry? What about divisions in North America or the diaspora Jews from those in Israel? And what can we better do to bridge those gaps?
I'll just say personally, for you know, as an elder millennial, that I the notion of playing into white supremacy as a security measure for the Jewish people, I think that is over, or at least it should be. You know, so that also means looking at Israel, looking at the Jewish community in the United States and throughout the world with a racial justice lens. And that again breeds accountability and demands an infrastructure change, demands a system change, and it's far past the time that we account for wrongdoings and, sorry, I'm in the city, and account for the ways that our communities and the state of Israel have moved in our names, and who we have left out from these conversations, from these movements, who are Jewish family and not white, right? And so this has to be part of the conversation.
Any intersection in between the racial justice movement and the Zionist movement? I know I'm taking it to a different direction with you, but I think that's really interesting. And like, do you see any intersect with any other social justice movements today with Zionism?
Yeah, of course. I mean, you saw it on the ground in Tel Aviv a few months ago with a protest against police brutality. You see it. You see it also in the United States with protests against police brutality. I will say that there are some things that just take it in what I like to call the wrong direction, that infuse anti-Semitism into this. And in Israel, this fight has been going on for a long time. So, and the Israelis there are not backing down. They're not saying like, oh, we're just going to leave Israel because white supremacy lives in Israel as well. No, they're sticking to it, building more coalitions, building more relationships, and saying this is not what Zionism looks like. This is Zionism is multiracial. Zionism is pluralistic. Zionism is progressive in a lot of ways, and we demand change.
So Chloe, Andrew, I know we kind of took that in a few different directions, but just to remind you, the question was really about any gaps that exist between Jews today and their own age group from older generations, or divisions in US and diaspora and Israeli Jews. And also we actually got a question from the Q&A that I think relates to this as well, from Irving Auerbach. The classic definition of Zionism is the return of the Jewish people from the diaspora to their own land. Has this definition changed for the younger generation? So feel free.
There's a lot of really interesting questions on the table that probably each one of them could be their own full hour session. What stuck out to me is there's definitely a shift in perception and engagement with Israel amongst American Jews, between older generations and younger generations. Younger generations much more critical of Israel, much more nuanced when it comes to talking about Israel, and that I've seen it in a family setting causes tension, where there are generations at the table who refuse to talk about Israel in any context that is not that it is 100% perfect, and that it's an ideal place and we need to support it unconditionally. And I don't think younger people are saying we don't love Israel, we don't support Israel, we don't want to engage, but they're doing it with a much more critical eye and a much more critical lens, and are engaging in much more focused ways. Whereas many of our parents and grandparents donated money, for example, to Israel through very large organizations which pooled resources and distributed it in Israel. Many of my peers, especially in the last several years, as they've become frustrated with current policies, have looked to still support Israel financially, but to do so through NGOs and organizations who are doing work on the ground in Israel that are much more tightly aligned with their values. So, my overarching theme to this is I want my peers and generation to engage with Israel from a place of loving Israel, which can lead to, in the same way as it does with my family, tension and some more pointed conversation, rather than a place of apathy or not understanding. That to me is the worst outcome. The other thing I thought you said was really interesting was the divide between American Jews and Israeli Jews, and it kind of relates to that definition. That I think that is, in terms of the definition of like the ingathering of exiles to Israel, I have always believed that is one part of the definition of Zionism. The reality is in 2020, almost 2021, is that we need to be very content with vibrant Jewish life existing in Israel and vibrant Jewish life existing, wherever Jews choose to live around the world. And we need to find a way to make sure that especially young Jews in Israel have a deep appreciation for Jewish life outside of Israel. And that awareness in Israel does not exist really unless a young Israeli has gone on shlichut or some other program in the Jewish community in North America or elsewhere in the Jewish world. That awareness isn't there, and that too is necessary for like strong Jewish peoplehood and Israel diaspora connection, so on and so forth.
I think that's something that I've personally noticed, is that Jews who are newer to America, like my family being Iranian American Jews, I noticed that my friends are much more Zionist and much more active in Israel advocacy versus people who don't know really firsthand the importance of having Israel. And as far as the divide between diaspora Jews and Jews in Israel, I think there is a big disconnect. This summer, I had the privilege to participate in a program that connected StandWithUs Emerson Fellows to the Israeli Fellows that are living in Israel. And I think conversations like those, meetings like those, will connect us and close the gap in continued partnerships between North American Jewish teenagers or college students to Israelis.
Yeah, there's a lot there. And I think there's a great follow-up question here in the Q&A from Orly Tamir. Do you think that Israel needs to take the views and opinions of Jews in the diaspora into consideration when making decisions or creating, updating laws and regulations?
I mean, weren't some of the first set of laws in Israel based off of New York state law? Well, it really depends on like how you're moving, right? Is this an international thing where this one policy is going to impact Jews across the world? I think yes, that you should take opinions and thoughts from Jews outside of Israel into effect or into consideration. It's not, the way that it's set up, it's not just about Israel. What Israel does impacts us here. If it's a really horrible move, then yes, anti-Semites will grab onto that and fuel up, and then we will see more anti-Semitic attacks sometimes. And that's not to say that Israel is responsible for those anti-Semitic attacks. It's just we have to be mindful of how we move. Also, just to talk about the whole Israel being perfect or anything, usually systems of oppression demand perfection. It seeks perfection. It demands that people fighting against it be perfect in order to combat it, and that's just complete BS, right? Also, no country, no government in this entire world is infallible. No government is devoid of mistakes, horrible mistakes at that. And there are some really great things that are coming out of Israel, and there are a lot of great things that are on the ground, a lot of great initiatives, a lot of great relationships on the ground that are making a more peaceful future possible.
Chloe or Andrew, do you want to chime in on this one? I personally think that Israel policy should be dictated by Israeli citizens who live there and understand the unique challenges and issues going on in the country. And I think, I don't believe that non-Israeli citizens should have a say in Israeli policy, but I'm curious for Andrew and Chloe's take on this one.
I agree with what you were just saying. As much as I want to say yes and give my voice as a Jew in Los Angeles to the Israeli government, I'm not the one who's living there. I'm not the one who has to travel to, who hears sirens in the middle of the night and has to go seek safety. As much as I want to have a voice, I'm not Israeli. I'm not the one living there. And I feel like it would be a privileged take to, from my opinion, to have a voice in the country that I'm not currently residing in.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think, on matters of domestic importance, the elected Israeli government needs to make decisions in the interest of a sovereign country, and the way that our government needs to make decisions in the interest of our country. It's very easy to be an outsider looking in and kind of cherry picking policies and issues that you would like to see different. I would say two things. One, one way that Jews around the world do have impact and input and influence into that conversation is through things like the World Zionist Congress, which is, in effect, like the parliament of the Jewish people, and does have material impact on not every facet of Israeli policy, but definitely some, and some very critical ones. The other thing I would say is, there are some issues in Israel which I do believe that the government should take into account, and I say take into account as part of a larger conversation, the viewpoints of Jews, in the diaspora. For example, the Western Wall, which is one example. Is that a holy site for Israeli Jews, or is that a holy site for the Jewish people? And what does that? What are the policy implications of something like that? And I also think that the role.
Sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah.
Do you feel that way with any other country, with any other people, kind of on the flip side of that? And I realize that Israel is different for a million reasons, but I just always like to think of it in the other terms as well.
You're right, and that's the argument I would use too. Of course, Israel is different. It's in a unique category as a country for American Jews, and that's why I said first. Israel is a sovereign country that needs to make decisions through its elected government that serve the interests of its citizens. I, as an American citizen, don't have a vote in that equation. Of course, I've got opinions. Of course, I've got perspective, as do everyone else on this call. But I think on matters that relate to Jewish peoplehood, are they legally compelled to take the opinion or the input of Jews around the world? Of course not. Does it elevate the conversation and elevate some of the decisions and elevate, Jewish peoplehood? And is that an opportunity for the Israeli prime minister and president to engage? Absolutely. And I think there have been many times, and far too many times, especially in recent years, where Israeli leaders have fallen short on that.
Sure. Another interesting question from the Q&A, Sue Polanski asks, are any of you veterans? Can you relate or imagine a life of a young IDF soldier? How do you speak about the role of IDF when young people attack Zionism? Do you avoid that topic? And I think generally we can make this more as Israel as kind of a militaristic state, and how people attack the IDF, and how do you kind of discuss that with others?
I think that's a hard one to answer a lot of the times. I think it's, the military is definitely part of Israeli culture, and it's a prime staple, and people are very proud to have military service in whatever way or way, shape, form it takes. I have never been in military service myself. My father was a Marine, but you know, I will say with most of the young Israelis that I met when I was staffing Taglit Birthright Israel trips and working through that organization, you know, that was a strong connection to hear their opinions on Israel, even as they serve in the military, and there are a million and one views within Israel from IDF soldiers. At the same time, you know, there is a need for protecting Israel. There are actual threats. This is like, this is not up for debate that there are actual threats. And growing up in that environment, you know, I can only speak as somebody who grew up in the United States as a Black man, understanding that like when I leave the house, there's a really big chance that like I'm not walking back home, or I, and that's an everyday thing. Have I had rockets shot at me? Yes, but only in Israel. Have bullets flown by my head? Yes, in the United States mostly. I'm not saying that they are necessarily the same thing, but they are both like they were both real threats, and Israel does face real threats. And having a military right now is probably the best thing. Now, what decisions are made with those resources, that's another issue.
Sure. I think, personally, the Jewish people came out of the Holocaust with two contradicting conclusions. And a lot of people talk about this often, of the two contradicting conclusions of the Jewish people are, one, we need to survive. We need to do everything in our power to survive. And we need to do it by ourselves, and the world will not come to our rescue. And number two, we are a moral people and we need to be moral. And the only people we're looking up to is the one saving Jews. I think that these two conclusions often, contradict each other on a daily basis in Israel, especially a soldier, you're standing with people shooting at you in Gaza from a school, and you have to think to yourself, do I shoot back and protect ourselves and save ourselves? Do we survive, or do we, from a moral standpoint, like, can we shoot back and, harm another people? So I think that's something that's always, there's this contradiction that's always there living as an Israeli, and especially in the military. Andrew and Chloe, do you have anything you want to add to that?
I'll just say I'm not an expert in the IDF. I'm not an expert in the American military, for that matter. Israel has the right to defend itself. It has the right to protect its citizens, as does every country. I think part of the issue and we kind of alluded to this earlier, is we, both Jewish Americans, but people abroad in general tend to cherry pick headlines in Israel and use them to further whatever point of view they already had before. There are things, stories that's around the IDF that, of course, are cause for concern. I'm sitting here in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I'm not in Israel, and that
Right.
gives perspective. The last thing I'll say is, and I think to your question that was actually asked in the chat around, I've met many people over the years that I've been involved in the Jewish world who have served in the IDF, and many times I've met their parents, and that is a life-changing experience as a Jew living in the diaspora, to see that imposed commitment to the state of Israel and what that means for an individual and a family. And that needs to be understood too by people who use headlines and incomplete stories to further a political ideology or bent against Israel.
Sure. And I think, again, it's really, you know, a matter of singling out Israel, you know, when these issues exist with every other military and every other country in the world. I mean, obviously there's unique issues to Israel geopolitically and in every other way, but, you know, a military is a military, and most of these issues exist in every other country as well, and to varying degrees. So, okay, we have about 4 minutes left. I know we have a hard out at 2. I don't know if you guys want to try and tackle one more question. There's a lot of really interesting ones here. Bill Mowat, well, that's funny. Zoe Katz, how do you discuss the concept of all ethnic Jews, including Ashkenazi Jews, being indigenous to Israel, especially if and when anti-Zionists try to deny this? And I need about 1 minute to wrap up, so we can have a minute and a half here to answer this. If anyone wants to take a stab at it.
That's a really good question. I think one way to respond to that is that, like, Ashkenazi Jews during like the Nuremberg laws weren't considered German. There's always been, you don't belong here, and our roots, all Jews' roots, are indigenous to Judea. And for some, it's harder to describe that, especially if you are white passing, but that's your history, and I don't think that anyone has a right to take away your history from you.
Sure. Okay. I want to thank all of our speakers for having this important conversation with us today and for being such engaged participants. Thank you guys so much. As a reminder, within the next few days, we'll be sending a follow-up email with relevant resources and materials, including a short feedback survey to help you continue the conversation with your friends, family, and community members. We look forward to seeing you at the Israel Action Network's upcoming sessions, including our BDS 101, Understanding the Fundamentals of BDS program, which will take place tomorrow at 1 p.m. Eastern, and the other 2 sessions in our Zionism series with AZM, Jewish Denominations Approach Israel and Zionism, which will take place on Wednesday, October 14th at 1 p.m. Eastern, and Inside the World Zionist Congress happening this week, which will be on Monday, October 19th at 3 p.m. Eastern. You can learn more details about the series and register by going to azm.org/IAN-Zionism-series. Thank you guys so much, and we wish you a great rest of your day. Thanks, guys.